So, imagine for a second that you accidentally touch your hand to a hot stove.
Oh, yeah. We've all been there.
Right. And in like a fraction of a millisecond, your hand just violently recoils.
Yeah, you pull away before you even consciously realize you're burning yourself.
Exactly. And, we totally take that speed for granted. But the actual electrical signal traveling down the biological wires in your arm.
It's technically not fast enough.
Right. Inherently, it is not fast enough to make that happen. If your nerves relied purely on the raw, uninsulated flow of ions,
your hand would just blister and burn severely before the muscle ever got the memo to pull away.
Exactly. For you to pull your hand away in time, your body has to essentially manipulate the literal laws of biophysics inside your arm.
It is an incredible engineering problem, honestly. You have to send a signal over a meter in length using nothing but charged salt water.
Right, salt water.
In milliseconds, and without the signal dying out along the way. And the solution the human body came up with is, well, it's arguably one of the most elegant adaptations in all of mammalian biology.
And that adaptation is exactly what we are obsessed with today. So for you listening, whether you're staring down a medical board exam or trying to untangle clinical neurology, or, you're just endlessly curious about how you are currently able to process the sensory input of my voice, this deep dive is totally for you.
We are tearing into a massive stack of high-level USMLE and NBME medical review notes today.
Yeah, the heavy stuff. And the entire focus is the nervous system's expressways. We are looking directly at myelin.
The goal today is to really decode the physiology behind that biological insulation. We're going to explore the distinct types of glial cells that manufacture it.
The builders.
Right, the builders. And the specific ways myelin alters electrical resistance and capacitance to achieve these impossible speeds. Plus, the strict hierarchy of which signals get the fast lane, and ultimately what happens when this system breaks down.
Yeah, the pathology. Let's jump right into the architecture, though, because reading through these notes, the very first misconception that gets aggressively corrected is what myelin actually is.
It's a huge point of confusion.
I always pictured it like the plastic coating you see on a copper wire, or maybe the rubber around a phone charger. Just inert, dead insulation.
Yeah, that plastic wire coating analogy is everywhere, and it completely obscures the biological reality. Myelin isn't something that's just secreted and left behind like a shell.
Right.
It is a repeatedly wrapped, heavily lipid-rich plasma membrane, and that membrane is physically attached to and part of a living glial cell.
So it's literally an extension of the cell's own body.
Exactly. The cell flattens out its own membrane, extruding almost all of the cytoplasm, like the cellular fluid, so that the inner surfaces of the membrane collapse onto each other.
Wow.
It creates these incredibly dense, tightly schooled lipid bilayers, and it wraps around the neuronal axon dozens, sometimes over 100 times.
Over 100 times.
Yeah. And because it's part of a living cell, it requires constant metabolic upkeep, constant energy, constant molecular maintenance.
Which means it's vulnerable. It can starve or be poisoned or be attacked. But before we get to the destruction part, we have to look at the builders. The notes highlight this major geographic divide in how myelin is constructed.
Right, the two environments.
Yeah, we've got the central nervous system, so the brain and the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, which is basically all the nerves extending out to the limbs, the organs, the muscles, and they absolutely do not share construction crews.
The evolutionary divergence here is just fascinating. In the central nervous system, the myelinating cell is the oligodendrocyte.
Okay, oligodendrocyte.
And embryologically, this originates from the neural tube. But once you leave the spinal cord and enter the peripheral nervous system, the myelinating cell is the Schwann cell.
Which comes from somewhere else entirely, right?
Right. It comes from an entirely different embryonic origin, the neural crest.
Okay, so different origins, different names. But it's not just a naming convention. The structural diagrams in the notes they're wild.
Oh, they look completely different.
I'm looking at the oligodendrocyte, and it looks like a microscopic octopus. The main cell body sits out in the tissue, and it reaches out these long, multiple tentacles.
Grabbing onto several different neighboring axons.
Yes, and wrapping a segment of each one. The mnemonic the notes provide is oligo equals one to many.
A great mnemonic.
But then I look at the Schwann cell in the periphery, and it's completely different. It's not reaching out to grab multiple wires. The entire Schwann cell just flattens itself against one single axon and rolls itself up around it.
Like a single hot dog bun wrapping around one specific inch of a hot dog.
The octopus and the hot dog bun. I love that. My immediate thought reading this was just why? Like, why would the human body evolve two completely different strategies to do the exact same job of wrapping fat around a wire?
Right.
Is the octopus model just vastly superior and the peripheral nerves didn't get the memo?
It comes out of two completely different sets of environmental pressures, specifically space constraints and the need for regeneration.
Yeah, I mean, the skull is a rigid box.
Oh, right. There's no room to expand.
Exactly. If we used a 1-to-1 cellular ratio for the billions of myelinated internodes in the central nervous system, the sheer volume of cell bodies would require our heads to be, massively larger.
We'd all be walking around with giant bobbleheads.
Basically, yeah. So the oligodendrocyte is the ultimate evolutionary compromise. You get maximum myelination density with a minimum somatic footprint.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. But that spatial restriction kind of disappears once you exit the spinal cord, right?
Yes. Once you're in the peripheral nervous system, running out to your limbs and organs, the contractor changes. It switches to the Schwann cell.
And the Schwann cell operates on a very strict 1-to-1 ratio.
It does. A single Schwann cell dedicates its entire existence to wrapping one single segment of one single axon.
It's very focused.
Incredibly focused. It envelops the axon and then repeatedly wraps its own plasma membrane around it, sort of like rolling up a sleeping bag. And it extrudes all the cytoplasm from between the layers until you're left with this incredibly dense, compacted sheath of pure lipid bilayer.
So let's analyze the ingredients of that compacted sheath, because this is where the biochemistry really dictates the biophysics.
Right, the raw materials.
Myelin is exceptionally lipid-rich. It contains phospholipids, sphingolipids like sphingomyelin, and glycolipids such as galactocerbicides and sulfatides.
And there are also crucial structural proteins acting as the molecular glue. Things like myelin basic protein, proteolipid protein, and in the peripheral system, PMP22.
But there's also a massive amount of cholesterol in this matrix. And, hearing cholesterol usually triggers alarm bells for anyone casually reading about health.
Oh, for sure. The vilification of cholesterol is a massive biochemical trap. We really have to separate systemic cardiovascular pathology from neurobiology.
Because in the nervous system, cholesterol isn't the enemy, right? It's an absolute necessity.
Yeah. It is structurally vital. Remember, a plasma membrane is a lipid bilayer. The phospholipids have these hydrophilic heads that face the watery environment and hydrophobic fatty acid tails pointing inward.
Right, the classic cell membrane structure.
Exactly. But if a membrane is composed solely of phospholipids, its fluidity is highly susceptible to temperature changes. It can become too liquid, or it can crystallize and become completely rigid.
So cholesterol molecules, they insert themselves right between those phospholipid tails. And because of its rigid sterile ring structure, cholesterol acts as this bidirectional buffer for membrane fluidity.
That's the perfect way to describe it. It prevents the hydrophobic tails from packing too closely together and solidifying, but at the same time, it restricts their excessive movement so the membrane doesn't become too permeable.
So when a Schwann cell or an oligodendrocyte is creating dozens of layers of tightly packed membrane, it requires just astronomical amounts of cholesterol to maintain the organizational stability of that multilamellar structure.
Yes. It's not acting as a triglyceride for energy storage. The phospholipids and the cholesterol are literally the structural bricks and mortar of the myelin sheath.
Which brings us to the ultimate question. Why expend such immense cellular energy to synthesize all these lipids, traffic all this cholesterol, and wrap these axons? What is the myelin actually doing to the electrical signal?
Right, because the myelin itself isn't generating the action potential.
Exactly.
The myelin alters the passive electrical properties of the axon membrane. It changes the physics of the biological cable in two very distinct ways. First, it drastically increases membrane resistance, which we denote as ARM.
Okay, I want to clarify something here for the listener, because increasing resistance intuitively sounds, detrimental if you're trying to conduct a signal. Like, if I increase the resistance in an electrical wire, the current drops.
I totally get that. That confusion stems from conflating longitudinal resistance with transverse membrane resistance.
Oh, okay. Let's unpack that difference.
We are not talking about the axial resistance down the center of the axon that actually needs to be low for fast conduction. We are talking about the transverse resistance, so across the axonal membrane itself.
Meaning from the inside of the cell to the outside.
Exactly. An unmyelinated membrane has ion channels, pumps, and just natural leakiness. When an action potential fires and sodium rushes in, that depolarizing current spreads down the axon, but a significant portion of it just leaks out through the membrane into the extracellular fluid.
Okay, let's use an analogy here. Imagine an unmyelinated axon is like a high-pressure water pipe, but it's riddled with microscopic holes.
Yes, a leaky pipe.
Right. As you force water through it, pressure bleeds out continuously along the length of the pipe, so the signal dissipates very quickly over short distance. But by wrapping that pipe in thick layers of lipid-rich membrane, you are essentially applying heavy-duty duct tape over all those holes.
That is exactly it. The duct tape is the increased arm. By increasing the transverse resistance, the depolarizing current is forced to travel longitudinally down the interior of the axon rather than leaking out.
So the current can propagate much further before it decays.
Yes, but preventing the leak is only half of the biophysical advantage. The second, and arguably more profound effect, is that myelin decreases membrane capacitance, or HEMA.
And capacitance is notoriously difficult to conceptualize in biology. I mean, we aren't dealing with metal plates and vacuums like in a physics lab. We're dealing with salty water and thin layers of fat.
Right, it's messy. But just think of capacitance as the membrane's ability to store an electrical charge. The intracellular fluid is electronegative relative to the extracellular fluid.
So the inside is negative, the outside is positive.
Exactly. And because the lipid bilayer is extremely thin, those opposite charges attract each other across the membrane. The positive charges line up on the outside, and the negative charges line up on the inside. They basically hold each other tightly in place via electrostatic attraction.
Meaning the axon has to actively overcome that stored charge, and it has to sort of discharge the capacitor.
Yeah.
Before it can change its local voltage and propagate the next action potential.
Right. We can call that the charge load. It's an energy barrier.
And in physics, capacitance is inversely proportional to the distance between the two conductive surfaces.
Yes. In an unmyelinated axon, the distance between the inside and outside fluids is just the width of a single lipid bilayer. It's like 5 nanometers. The attraction is incredibly strong, meaning capacitance is very high, and the charge load is massive.
But when a Schwann cell comes along and wraps the axon 50 times, it physically increases the distance between the inside of the axon and the outside extracellular fluid.
You're pulling the positive and negative charges further apart.
And as that distance increases, that electrostatic attraction between the ions weakens dramatically. The capacitance drops.
Exactly. Because the capacitance is low, less total charge is required to depolarize the membrane. The voltage can change rapidly with a much smaller influx of current.
So we prevent the current from leaking out, and we make the pipe itself require less current to trigger the next phase, which perfectly sets up the mechanism of saltatory conduction.
Right, because the internodes, the myelinated segments, are heavily insulated and have very low capacitance. The current shoots down the inside of the axon incredibly fast.
But doesn't go forever, right? It still degrades slightly due to internal axial resistance.
Yeah, so the signal has to be periodically regenerated. The cell leaves these microscopic gaps in the myelin sheath called the nodes of Ranvier.
And the cell concentrates almost all of its voltage-gated sodium channels in these tiny gaps.
Well, there would be no point in placing them under the myelin because the extracellular sodium couldn't reach them anyway. The duct tape is in the way.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
So the current travels passively and rapidly under the myelin. Then, when it hits a node of Ranvier, it encounters this dense cluster of sodium channels.
The threshold is reached instantly, sodium rushes in, and the action potential is regenerated. So the action potential is regenerated discontinuously at the nodes, but the electrical current itself travels continuously inside the axon.
And from the outside, the signal appears to sort of jump from node to node, which is the literal definition of saltatory conduction.
Right, from the Latin saltare, to leap. And the energy efficiency of this system is just as important as the speed.
Oh, absolutely. In an unmyelinated axon, you have to open sodium channels, let sodium in, let potassium out, and then run those ATP-dependent sodium-potassium pumps to restore the gradients across every single micrometer of the cell.
The ATP demand of that continuous conduction is just monumental. But with saltatory conduction, the ion flux only occurs at the nodes of Ranvier, which represent a tiny fraction of the total axonal surface area.
So the sodium-potassium ATPase pumps only have to work at those specific nodes, which spares the cell an immense metabolic burden.
And our source material actually provides a master mnemonic to synthesize all this physics into a memorable sequence. It's lipid to leak to load to leap.
I love that. It perfectly tracks the causal biophysics. The lipid-rich myelin sheath means less current leak. which represents the increased membrane resistance.
Right, the duct tape.
Exactly. And this separation leads to less capacitive charge load, representing the decreased capacitance. With less leak and less load, the current leap rapidly to the next node, achieving fast saltatory conduction.
It's a beautifully elegant system. The nervous system, cholesterol is an absolute necessity for survival.
So myelin is packed with it.
It is loaded with cholesterol. Our nerves would instantly fail without it.
Why? What does it actually do in the membrane?
It regulates fluidity. The cholesterol molecule has this very rigid steroid ring structure. It physically wedges itself between the flexible hydrocarbon tails of the phospholipids.
Okay, so it's like putting stiff boards between wobbly posts.
That's exactly it. At body temperature, those phospholipid tails want to move around. If they move too much, the membrane would be too fluid and small molecules would leak through.
So the cholesterol stiffens it up.
Right. The rigid steroid rings restrict the movement, packing the lipids tightly together and making sure that 100-layer wrap stays totally structurally sound.
Okay, so we've got the phospholipids making the barrier and the cholesterol locking them into this tight, stable configuration. But, I mean, if you just push a bunch of layers of fat together, won't they eventually just slide apart or unspool?
They absolutely would. Right. There has to be a mechanism holding the concentric layers together once all the liquid is squeezed out.
So what's the glue?
Proteins. Highly specialized structural proteins embedded right in the lipid bilayer. And interestingly, the central and peripheral nervous systems use completely different proteins for this job.
Oh, really? So the brain uses different staples than the leg?
Yeah. In the central nervous system, you have myelin basic protein, or MBP, and proteolipid protein, PLP.
Myelin basic protein. Got it.
MBP is fascinating because it acts like biological electrostatic Velcro.
Velcro. How does that work?
Well, MBP is highly positively charged, and the phospholipid heads on the inside of the cell membrane are negatively charged.
Ah, opposites attract.
Exactly. It binds the inner surfaces of the membrane together tightly, fusing them into that major dense line we talked about.
Okay, what about out in the body? The peripheral nervous system.
Out there, the Schwann cells use a different suite of proteins, primarily one called peripheral myelin protein 22, or PMP22.
PMP22.
Along with myelin protein 0. These act as actual transmembrane crosslinks. They physically staple the opposing membrane faces together.
So if these proteins, like PMP22 or MBP, if they get messed up,
the structural integrity of the myelin unspools, the layers separate, and it completely strips the nerve of its functional properties.
Okay, let's unpack that function, because now we have the blueprint. We know it's a dense wrap of phospholipids stabilized by cholesterol and stapled together by specific proteins.
Right, and understanding that architecture lets us look at the biophysics. How does this wrap actually change the electrical signaling of the nerve?
And we should clarify, myelin does not generate the action potential itself, right?
Correct. The neuron generates the spark. Myelin's only job is to manipulate the biophysical properties of the axon to make that signal move as fast as possible.
Which brings us to cable theory.
Yes. You can model an axon just like an electrical cable with specific resistance and capacitance values.
Okay, let's take these one at a time. The first mechanism myelin exploits is increasing membrane resistance.
Right. Denoted mathematically as R sub m, membrane resistance measures how easily electrical current can leak out of the axon and into the surrounding fluid.
So in a bare, unmyelinated axon,
the membrane is relatively leaky. When a nerve fires and positive sodium ions rush in, that current tries to flow straight down the inside of the nerve.
But because it's a leaky hose.
Exactly. A huge portion of that electrical current dissipates outward. It leaks right back out into the extracellular fluid.
So the signal just fizzles out.
It degrades exponentially over a very, very short distance.
So how does a bare nerve even work then?
By brute force. To keep the signal moving, the nerve has to continuously, actively regenerate the spark at every single millimeter of membrane. It has to keep opening more channels, bringing in more sodium, just to replace what leaked out.
That sounds incredibly slow.
It's slow and it's tedious. It's called continuous propagation.
Okay, so then you come in with 50 layers of tight lipid bilayers.
And you fundamentally change the physics. That dense hydrophobic myelin sheath massively increases the membrane resistance. The leak pathways are physically sealed off.
So it's exactly like taking that leaky garden hose and just wrapping it in heavy-duty waterproof duct tape.
Perfect analogy. When the sodium rushes in now, the current is trapped. The high resistance forces it to flow axially straight down the interior of the nerve.
Because there's nowhere else to go.
Right. So the depolarizing signal can travel vastly further distances without decaying.
Okay, that makes total sense. Plug-in leaks equals better flow. But the second mechanism, this one is a bit more counterintuitive. Myelin decreases membrane capacitance?
Yes, denoted as C sub M. Capacitance is a measure of a system's ability to store separated electrical charge.
Wait, I'm going to push back on this.
Yeah.
If capacitance is the ability to store charge, wouldn't we want more capacitance in an electrical system? Why is decreasing it a good thing?
It's a great question. You have to remember how a capacitor actually works. The cell membrane acts exactly like a capacitor in a circuit. You have the conductive fluid inside the cell and the conductive fluid outside, separated by the thin, non-conducting lipid barrier.
The plates of the capacitor.
Exactly. Electrostatic forces cause positive charges on the outside to strongly attract negative charges on the inside across that thin gap. The membrane stores those opposing charges.
Right.
But here's the catch. Before an electrical signal can travel down the nerve and change the voltage of the next section, the incoming current first has to discharge that local capacitor.
Oh. It has to satisfy the stored charge first.
Precisely. It has to fill the bucket before it can overflow. The time it takes to neutralize that stored charge wastes the incoming current and dictates how fast the voltage can actually rise.
Ah, I get it now. A bare membrane has high capacitance because the fluids are so close together, right? Just a few nanometers apart?
Yes. The charges attract each other very strongly across that tiny distance. A large amount of charge gets stored.
So when the signal arrives, it wastes all its energy and time just neutralizing the plates.
Exactly. It's a massive drag on the speed.
So how does myelin fix that?
By looking at the physical architecture of a capacitor, if you increase the physical distance between the two conductive plates, you decrease the capacitance.
Because the attractive force drops off when they are further apart.
Right, and myelin dramatically increases that distance. By wrapping the axon in dozens of layers of fat, it acts as a very thick dielectric material.
It pushes the outside fluid way further away from the inside fluid.
It does. The capacitance of the membrane drops precipitously. Barely any charge is stored across the myelinated segments.
So the incoming current doesn't have to waste time discharging anything.
Nope. It instantly changes the voltage of the membrane ahead of it, allowing the signal to just sweep down the interior of the axon at phenomenal speeds.
Okay, so it sweeps down the internode. That's what we call the myelinated section, right?
Yeah, the internode. It sweeps down passively and almost instantaneously.
But wait, biological systems aren't perfect conductors. Even with a duct tape, won't the signal eventually fade out because of internal resistance?
It absolutely will. If the myelin were just one continuous, unbroken tube all the way down your leg, the signal would eventually die before it reached your foot.
So it needs amplifier stations.
Exactly. And anatomically, these are the nodes of Ranvier.
The nodes.
Yeah. The myelin sheath is applied in segments. Between each adjacent Schwann cell, there's a microscopic gap where the axon membrane is totally bare.
Exposed right to the outside fluid.
Right. And these bare gaps, these nodes, are densely packed with voltage-gated sodium channels, specifically a subtype called NaV 1.6 in mature nerves.
So the architecture's highly calculated.
Mathematically precise. The distance between the nodes is optimized so the fast passive current traveling under the myelin reaches the next node right before it decays below the threshold needed to trigger a spark.
Wow. So the rapid voltage change arrives from the fat-covered section, hits the bare node, and bam.
Bam. The voltage-gated sodium channels fly open, a massive influx of sodium rushes in, and the action potential is actively, powerfully regenerated at full strength.
And then that new boosted current sweeps passively down the next myelinated section to the next node.
Exactly. This discontinuous propagation is called saltatory conduction.
From the Latin saltare to leap or jump.
Yes, but we should clear up a really common misconception here. The electrical spark does not literally jump through the air or the extracellular space from node to node.
Right, like an arc of lightning. That's how it's always drawn in textbooks.
I know, and it's wrong. The current flows continuously through the liquid inside the axon. It's the active regeneration of the action potential that leaps. The ion exchange only happens at the nodes.
Okay, so the speed is insane, but I want to talk about the energy savings. Because this has to have a massive metabolic push.
Oh, it's equally profound. Nerves are ravenous consumers of cellular energy.
Right, because after sodium rushes in to make the spark, the nerve eventually has to pump it all back out to reset itself.
Exactly. It uses the sodium-potassium ATPase pump. And that molecular machine requires 1 molecule of ATP cellular energy for every single cycle it performs.
So in a bare axon, without myelin,
Sodium enters across the entire length of the nerve, every micrometer, meaning the pumps have to expend massive amounts of ATP to push it all back out across the entire surface area.
which would require an astronomical amount of energy.
It would, but by restricting the ion exchange strictly to the microscopic nodes of Ranvier, myelin drastically limits the total amount of sodium that enters the axon in the first place.
Oh, because the doors are only open at the nodes.
Precisely. The pumps only have to work at the nodes rather than along the whole nerve. Myelin effectively reduces the metabolic costs of nerve conduction by an order of magnitude.
So without myelin, our brains would literally starve us.
If our brains utilize unmyelinated axons for all their complex processing, the caloric requirement would be biologically unfeasible. We would have to eat constantly just to fund our thoughts.
That is wild.
And the evolutionary advantage is just undeniable. This high speed and low metabolic cost allowed vertebrates to develop incredibly complex, synchronized nervous systems.
Because what do invertebrates do? Like a squid, they don't have myelin.
Right. To get high conduction velocities without myelin, invertebrates like the squid rely on sheer size. The squid giant axon can be a full millimeter in diameter.
A millimeter for a single cell.
Yes. By massively increasing the diameter, you decrease the internal resistance, so current flows faster. But the physical space requirement is huge.
Right. If human peripheral nerves had to be that thick to be fast.
Our spinal cords would be the size of tree trunks, and our limbs would be way too thick to even bend. Myelin solves this space constraint.
It lets us bundle thousands of microscopically thin, high-speed wires into compact peripheral nerves.
Exactly.
But taking that into account, producing and maintaining all this myelin still takes up some space, and it still costs energy.
Right. The body doesn't just arbitrarily myelinate every single nerve fiber. It operates on a strict hierarchy.
It prioritizes the most critical data for the express lanes.
Yes.
Peripheral nerves are constantly moving, stretching, getting bumped, compressed, or even severed. A peripheral nerve needs to be able to heal. And this is where the Schwann cell's one-to-one architecture becomes its absolute superpower.
So how does it heal?
Well, if you suffer a deep cut on your arm and sever a peripheral nerve, the axon distal to the cut degenerates. But the Schwann cells that were wrapped around it actually survive.
Wait, they survive the cut?
They do. They actually de-differentiate, multiply, and form a physical living tube. It's a scaffolding. And they secrete growth factors to guide the regenerating axon all the way back to its target muscle.
So the hot dog buns line up and basically build a tunnel to tell the wire exactly where to grow back.
Precisely. They actively orchestrate the repair. Now compare that to the oligodendrocyte in the central nervous system.
The octopus.
Right? Oligodendrocytes are incredibly fragile, and they are notoriously terrible at regeneration. If there is damage to the spinal cord, not only do the oligodendrocytes fail to form a helpful scaffolding, they actually release inhibitory molecules that actively prevent axons from regrowing.
Wait, they actively block repair?
Yes, they form what's called a glial scar, which acts as a physical and chemical barrier to repair.
Why on earth the central nervous system evolved to prevent its own healing? That seems like a terrible design flaw.
It's a heavily debated topic in neurobiology, actually. But the prevailing theory points to the sheer complexity of central networks.
How's that?
If a peripheral motor nerve regrows, it just needs to find the bicep muscle, right? It's a simple point-to-point connection. But in the brain or spinal cord, a regenerating axon might miswire into a highly complex, delicate circuit. And that could cause intractable pain, severe spasticity, or even life-threatening seizures. So the evolutionary trade-off seems to be that in the CNS, it is safer to seal off the damage with a scar and prevent miswiring, rather than risk a rogue axon scrambling a vital network.
That is profound. The central system basically prioritizes the integrity of the network over the survival of the individual wire.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have the space-saving fragile octopus in the brain and the resilient scaffolding hot dog bun in the limbs. To really understand how they interact, the notes map out one specific critical highway, the corticospinal tract.
The main pathway for voluntary movement.
Yes. And this is where the terminology and medical notes can become an absolute minefield if we aren't careful.
Oh, absolutely. The text explicitly flags the structural definitions here.
Let's lock this down, because I admit I totally used to use these words interchangeably. The notes are very strict. A tract versus a peripheral nerve.
Right. A tract is a bundle of axons traveling exclusively within the central nervous system. It never leaves the brain or spinal cord.
Okay.
Therefore, All the myelin in a tract is built by oligodendrocytes. A peripheral nerve, on the other hand, is a bundle of axons traveling outside the CNS. So all the myelin in a peripheral nerve is built by Schwann cells.
So the corticospinal tract, by definition, is a purely central highway.
Correct.
Let's trace a signal down it. Let's say I decide to wiggle my right big toe. The command originates in the cortex. And I was super surprised to read that it doesn't just come from the primary motor cortex.
Right, it's widely distributed.
The notes break it down to about 30% primary motor, 30% premotor and supplementary motor, and a massive 40% from the somatosensory cortex.
Which really shatters the illusion that movement is just a simple go button in the brain. If 40% of the movement command is coming from the sensory areas, it means every voluntary movement is fundamentally reliant on a real-time understanding of where your body currently is in space.
Right. You can't execute a smooth, coordinated toe wiggle if your brain isn't simultaneously processing the pressure of the floor, the tension in your calf,
The angle of your ankle.
everything, the ultimate feedback loop. So the neuron cell body sits up in the cortex. It fires the electrical signal down its axon. The notes trace this axon down through the corona radiata, which, by the way, looks like a massive fan of white matter. And then it all funnels down into a very narrow corridor called the posterior limb of the internal capsule.
And that funneling is a critical anatomical vulnerability.
Why is that?
Well, you have this massive sweeping fan of cortical fibers representing your entire body, and they all converge and pack incredibly tightly into the internal capsule to exit the brain. It's an extreme bottleneck.
Right.
This is why a tiny millimeter-sized stroke up in the cortex might only cause weakness in your hand, but an equally tiny lacunar stroke down in the internal capsule can wipe out the entire motor pathway.
Causing devastating paralysis on the entire opposite half of your body.
Exactly.
The ultimate choke point. Okay, so the signal survives the internal capsule, travels down the brainstem through the midbrain, the pons, and arrives at the medullary pyramids in the lower brainstem. And this is the famous crossing point, the decussation.
The caudal medulla. This is where roughly 85 to 90% of these millions of fibers physically cross over to the contralateral or opposite side of the body.
Wow.
And then they continue their journey down the spinal cord as the lateral corticospinal tract.
Which gives us the cardinal rule of clinical neurology from the notes. Above crossing equals opposite side. Below crossing equals same side.
A crucial rule.
So if I have a lesion or a tumor in my brain above the pyramids, the weakness will manifest on the left side of my body. But if I sever the lateral corticospinal tract down in my mid-back, below the crossing, the weakness is on the right side of my body.
Correct. The signal has already crossed over, so any damage from that point downward affects the ipsilateral, or same side. So our signal for the right big toe is crossed over. It is traveling down the right lateral corticospinal tract, heavily insulated by oligodendrocytes, until it reaches the lower lumbar levels of the spinal cord.
And then it enters the anterior horn of the spinal cord gray matter?
Yes. The transition zone.
The transition zone. This is the part that totally reframed my understanding of the nervous system. The notes describe this as the handoff between the upper motor neuron, the UMN, and the lower motor neuron, the LMN. I mean, I always assumed one single wire went from my brain all the way down to my toe.
Those people do, but it's not. It's a two-part relay race.
Okay, break that down for us.
The upper motor neuron never actually touches a muscle. Its entire job is to carry the signal from the cortex down to the anterior horn of the spinal cord and synapse, either directly or via an interneuron onto the lower motor neuron.
And the lower motor neuron is the one whose cell body sits in the spinal cord, but it shoots its axon out of the spinal cord.
Exactly. It enters a peripheral nerve, travels all the way down the leg, and physically drops the neurotransmitters onto the muscle fibers of the toe.
Okay, let's analyze what that means for our central theme today. Myelin. That one continuous intention to move a toe spans two completely distinct biological environments.
It does.
Right, because the upper motor neuron is entirely in the CNS, so it's myelinated by the octopus, the oligodendrocyte, but the lower motor neuron exits the cord. It becomes part of the peripheral nerve, so it's myelinated by the hot dog buns, the Schwann cells.
A single command, two different construction crews. And honestly, understanding this relay race is the only way to make sense of the clinical pathology notes regarding UMN versus LMN lesions.
Okay, let's explore this because this is heavily tested and honestly deeply counterintuitive at first glance.
Oh, absolutely.
The notes provide the classic symptom clusters. If you damage the lower motor neuron, the actual wire going to the muscle, you get low signs. Flaccid paralysis, decreased muscle tone, hyperreflexia, meaning the reflexes are absent or diminished.
Right.
That makes perfect sense to me. You cut the power line, the machine shuts off, the muscle goes limp, and eventually wastes away.
The logic there is very straightforward. Without the lower motor neuron, there is no electrical stimulation reaching the muscle fibers, period.
But the upper motor neuron signs, this is where I totally struggle. If I damage the upper motor neuron, say with a stroke in the brain, the notes say I get up signs. Increased muscle tone, severe spasticity, hyperreflexia, where my reflexes are violently exaggerated, and a positive Babinski sign.
It seems backwards, right?
Totally backwards. Wait, how does damaging the command wire cause the muscle to have more tone and more reflex activity? Shouldn't it also just go limp if it's not getting the brain's command?
It's a brilliant question, and it cuts to the core of what the upper motor neuron actually does. We think of the brain as just sending go commands, but in reality, a massive portion of the upper motor neuron's baseline activity is inhibitory. It acts as a dampener.
Like a brake pedal.
Exactly like a brake pedal. The local reflex arcs in the spinal cord, the circuits connecting sensory input directly to lower motor neuron output, they're highly excitable by default.
Oh, interesting.
If you tap the patellar tendon on your knee, that sensory signal enters the cord and immediately wants to trigger a massive explosive kick. But the upper motor neuron is constantly dripping inhibitory signals down the track, essentially saying, calm down, stay tight, but don't overreact.
So if a stroke wipes out the upper motor neuron,
You lose the brake pedal.
wow.
The lower motor neuron is perfectly intact, but it's suddenly unchained from central regulation. The local spinal reflexes go totally rogue. They become hyperexcitable. A slight stretch of the muscle triggers an exaggerated violent contraction.
So the baseline electrical activity ramps up, leading to rigid spastic muscle tone.
Precisely. The machine isn't shut off. It's running completely out of control.
That is fascinating. The UMN is the supervisor keeping the chaotic LMN factory in check. UMN lesion equals loss of inhibition, resulting in up signs. LMN lesion equals loss of connection, resulting in low signs.
You nailed it.
Okay, so we've mapped the highway, we know who builds the myelin, we know the anatomical route, and we know the relay handoff. Now we have to look under the hood, which naturally leads to the next massive question. If this duct tape toll booth destroying system is so flawless, so fast, and so energy efficient, why isn't every single nerve in my body heavily myelinated?
It's a fair question.
I mean, I woke up this morning with a slow, aching pain in my lower back that took forever to subside. Why did my body evolve to leave some signals so slow?
It brings us to the strict hierarchy of fibers in the nervous system. As incredible as myelin is, it is not free. The nervous system is constantly forced into extreme resource management regarding space and metabolic energy.
The notes break down a fundamental speed equation. Conduction velocity is determined by a combination of myelination and axon diameter.
Exactly. We know how myelin speeds things up, but axon diameter plays a crucial role by reducing internal resistance. Think of drinking a milkshake through a tiny coffee stirrer versus a wide boba straw.
Oh, good analogy.
The wider the straw, the less resistance the fluid faces, and the faster it flows. In biology, the larger the physical diameter of the axon, the less internal resistance the electrical current encounters.
So to achieve maximum biological speed, you need the widest possible axon wrapped in the thickest possible myelin.
And we reserve these absolute marvels of speed for our most critical functions. These are the A-alpha fibers. They govern the lower motor neurons commanding your skeletal muscles, and the group Ia sensory fibers coming from the muscle spindles.
Muscle spindles, that's proprioception, right? Like the body's internal GPS.
Exactly. Knowing exactly where your limbs are in space, the exact tension on every muscle fiber, and being able to instantly adjust balance to prevent falling, that data must reach the brain instantaneously. These large, heavily myelinated fibers conduct at speeds up to 120 meters per second.
120 meters per second. I did the math on this while reading the notes. That is roughly 268 miles per hour inside a human arm.
It is a staggering velocity. And in the central nervous system, the equivalents are the giant BET cells in the motor cortex. They send massive, heavily myelinated axons all the way down the corticospinal tract for rapid, highly precise voluntary movements.
But the notes highlight a massive exam trap regarding these BET cells. Because they are so famous, people assume the entire corticospinal tract is just packed these giant expressways. But the text explicitly states that BET cells make up only about 3% of the fibers in the corticospinal tract. Only 3%.
It is one of the most common misconceptions in neuroanatomy. There are over 1 million individual axons in a human corticospinal tract. If all of them were giant, heavily myelinated bet cell axons, your spinal cord would have to be the size of a tree trunk.
Wow.
It physically would not fit in the vertebral canal.
So what are the other 97% of the fibers doing?
The remaining 97% are much smaller, thinner, and less heavily myelinated fibers. They don't conduct at 268 miles per hour, but they don't need to. They handle tonic motor activity, postural modulation, the subtle, continuous background tuning of your muscle circuits.
Okay, that makes sense.
You need a massive, fast signal to play a Chopin etude on the piano or catch a falling glass. You do not need a lightning-fast signal to maintain baseline tension in your core muscles so you don't slump over in your chair.
The nervous system prioritizes based on the mission. The large fibers are the instant reflex, the emergency override. The smaller fibers are the steady background hum. And this hierarchy is even more dramatic on the sensory side. Myelinate every single nerve fiber. It operates on a strict hierarchy.
It prioritizes the most critical data for the express lanes.
Yes. We categorize nerve fibers based on their diameter and how thick their myelin sheath is. And that directly correlates to their conduction velocity.
Okay, so what's the golden rule here?
The primary rule of thumb. Largest diameter paired with the thickest myelin sheath equals the fastest conduction.
And the kings of that hierarchy are the A-alpha fibers.
The A-alpha fibers, they are massive, and they have incredibly dense, heavy myelin wrapping.
Because the physics scale perfectly. Big diameter means low internal resistance. Thick myelin means high membrane resistance and low capacitance.
Exactly. A-alpha fibers conduct signals at velocities up to 120 meters per second.
Let's convert that for people. 120 meters per second is roughly 268 miles per hour.
Inside your body.
That's absurd. What gets to travel at 268 miles per hour?
The central nervous system reserves these superhighways exclusively for functions where milliseconds mean the difference between life, death, or severe injury.
So motor control.
Right. Efferent motor commands to your skeletal muscles. When your brain says move your arm, that signal needs to hit the muscle instantaneously.
And what about on the sensory side? Going back up to the brain.
On the sensory side, A-alpha fibers carry afferent proprioceptive information.
Proprioception, meaning knowing where your body is in space.
Yes. It's the constant stream of data from receptors like muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs. It tells your brain the exact position, stretch, and tension of every muscle and joint in three-dimensional space all the time.
Why does that need to be so fast?
Because it governs unconscious balance. If you're running over uneven ground, your brain has to know the exact position and load on your ankle joint the millisecond your foot strikes the dirt.
Oh, to fire the corrective muscles so you don't snap your ankle.
Exactly. A delayed proprioceptive signal is a completely useless signal. The A-alpha fibers handle that continuous high-speed feedback loop.
Okay, so that's the absolute fastest. What's one step down?
Descending the hierarchy, we find the A-beta fibers. They still have a heavy myelin sheath, but their axon diameter is slightly smaller than the A-alpha group.
So they're a little slower, but still very fast.
Still incredibly fast. A-beta fibers transmit sensory modalities that need high temporal and spatial resolution, fine touch, vibration, and deep pressure.
Wait, I want to clarify something here. There is a distinction between the sensory receptor itself and the conducting fiber, right?
It's a critical concept, yes. A mechanoreceptor in your skin, like a Pacinian corpuscle, physically detects high-frequency vibration or deep pressure.
It gets squished, basically.
It deforms, creating a local receptor potential. But the corpuscle itself doesn't travel to the brain. It triggers the action potential in the attached A-beta fiber.
Got it. The corpuscle is the sensor, the A-beta fiber is the wire.
Exactly.
It's kind of counterintuitive that deep pressure travels on a fast wire. It feels like a slow, dull sensation.
It feels that way, but the brain needs to immediately map your mechanical interactions with the environment. Feeling the texture of something you're holding or the vibration of a tool in your hand, that requires the high-speed transmission of A-beta fibers.
Okay. Continuing down, we have A-delta fibers next.
The A-delta fibers represent a significant structural shift. They have small diameters, and they are only thinly myelinated.
Fewer layers of duct tape.
Right, meaning membrane capacitance is higher, resistance is lower compared to the upper groups. Their conduction velocity drops to a moderate pace, around 5 to 30 meters per second.
The moderate lane. What uses this lane?
Primarily nociception, which is pain and thermal sensations, specifically cold.
Sharp pain.
Yes. When tissue damage occurs, the A-delta fibers transmit the initial, sharp, acute, well-localized pain signal.
Okay, and finally, at the very bottom of the barrel,
The C fibers.
Dirt roads.
The ultimate dirt roads. C fibers have a very small diameter, and they have a complete total absence of myelin. They are entirely unmyelinated.
So they suffer from all the bad physics we talked about earlier. Low resistance, high capacitance.
Yes. The action potential has to be continuously regenerated along the entire bare membrane. No saltatory jumping.
So how slow are we talking?
A sluggish 0.5 to 2 meters per second.
Wow, that is a crawl. What are they carrying?
They carry the slow, dull, aching, diffuse pain. Also warmth, itch sensations, and the vast majority of the slow, autonomic signals that control organ function and blood vessel constriction.
Okay, this entirely explains the hook we started with. The double pain of the stubbed toe.
It perfectly explains it. The physical impact of hitting the bed frame causes immediate tissue damage. That damage simultaneously triggers both the thinly myelinated A delta pain fibers and the unmyelinated C pain fibers at the exact same site.
So both signals start the race up your leg at the exact same time.
Exactly, but the A delta signal, because it has that thin myelin sheath and can use saltatory conduction, it races up the spinal tract at 15 meters per second.
Reaching the brain almost instantly. Ouch, sharp impact at the left big toe.
Meanwhile, the identical signal from the same tissue damage initiated an action potential in the C fiber. But without myelin, it slowly trudges up the nerve at maybe 1 meter per second.
Taking the long, metabolically expensive route.
Right. It physically takes a second or two longer for that action potential to travel from your foot, up the spinal cord, and up to the cortex.
And when it finally gets there, you get that second wave, the deep, throbbing, nauseating ache.
The presence of just a few layers of cellular membrane literally dictates your perception of pain and time.
That is just incredible. The mechanical touch and vibration is carried by the large myelinated A beta fibers. They fire the signal to your brain at over 100 miles per hour.
Right.
But the tissue damage, the release of inflammatory chemicals triggering the pain receptors, that signal is loaded onto the unmyelinated C fibers. That delay you experience is the literal time it takes for the electrical signal to walk up the unmyelinated wire from your toe, up your leg, into your spinal cord.
But I have to push back on the evolutionary logic here. I understand space constraints, but pain is the body's ultimate alarm system. Wouldn't it be biologically advantageous to feel that deep tissue damage instantly so you can address it? Why relegate your most important alarm system to a dirt road?
You have to separate the types of pain. You do have vascular pain fibers, the A delta fibers. They're thinly myelinated and they carry sharp, acute, localized pain.
Okay.
If you touch a hot stove, the A delta fibers trigger the immediate withdrawal reflex. That is the emergency alarm. But the C fibers carry the deep, aching, lingering pain. The biological purpose of that slow pain isn't to trigger a rapid reflex. It's to enforce behavioral modification. It throbs, so you stop walking on the injured toe, allowing it to heal.
It's a reminder, not an alarm.
Exactly. And if the human body attempted to provide heavily myelinated expressways for every single pain, temperature, and itch receptor across the entire surface area of your skin and internal organs, the metabolic costs would literally starve you to death. And your peripheral nerves would be too thick to bend your joints.
Wow.
The unmyelinated C fiber is a brilliant compromise of space and energy.
It is terrifyingly beautiful how balanced the system is. But that brings us to the dark side of this deep dive. What happens when that perfect balance is destroyed? The clinical pathology of myelin.
And the high-level review notes emphasize a critical diagnostic distinction here, heavily tested on the boards regarding how to interpret a nerve conduction study, or NCS. They contrast demyelination with axonal loss.
Let's break this down meticulously. The notes say, demyelination is a velocity problem. Axonal loss is an amplitude problem.
Think about a peripheral nerve like a major highway with 100 individual lanes, each lane being an axon. If a patient suffers from an axonal neuropathy, say due to severe diabetes or trauma, the actual wires themselves are dying off. Let's say 50 of the 100 lanes are destroyed.
Okay, so half the wires are completely gone.
But the 50 wires that remain intact are still perfectly healthy and their myelin is untouched. So when you stimulate that nerve electrically, the signal travels down the remaining 50 lanes at a completely normal speed. The velocity is normal.
Right.
But because you only have half the wires firing, the total volume of the signal, the total electrical power arriving at the muscle is cut in half. The peak of the waveform shrinks.
Axonal loss equals decreased amplitude. The wire is cut, the signal is weak, but what gets through on time.
Now contrast that with a demyelinating disease. In pure demyelination, all 100 axons are perfectly intact. The wires are there. But the immune system, or a toxin, has stripped away the myelin insulation from all of them.
The duct tape is ripped off the leaky hose.
Exactly. What happens to the biophysics? The membrane resistance drops dramatically. The electrical current leaks out into the surrounding tissue. Simultaneously, the membrane capacitance shoots up. The naked membrane starts acting like a toll booth again, soaking up charge and delaying the voltage change.
So the signal is struggling to move forward. It takes longer to charge the membrane, and the current keeps leaking.
So when you look at the nerve conduction study, the total number of wires firing might still be somewhat normal initially, but the speed of the signal falls off a cliff. The conduction velocity plummets.
Demyelination equals decreased velocity. And the notes also mention temporal dispersion. I assume that means because the myelin loss is patchy, some lanes slow down more than others, so the signals all arrive at the muscle at different times, completely smeared out.
Perfectly stated. The sharp, synchronized command is smeared into a chaotic, asynchronous mess. And in severe cases, the current leak is so profound that the signal never even reaches the next node of Randier. The action potential simply dies halfway down the wire. This is called a complete conduction block.
And when we talk about demyelination in the central nervous system, the undisputed heavyweight champion in the notes is multiple sclerosis, or MS.
MS is a devastating immune-mediated inflammatory disease. For complex genetic and environmental reasons, the patient's own immune system identifies the central nervous system myelin, specifically the oligodendrocytes, as foreign invaders. Autoreactive T cells cross the blood-brain barrier and orchestrate a targeted destruction of the oligodendrocytes.
The octopus is being hunted.
And because oligodendrocytes myelinate the brain and spinal cord, the symptoms are incredibly varied. Visual loss if it hits the optic nerve, profound weakness if it hits the corticospinal tract, severe ataxia if it hits the cerebellar tracts. It causes multiple lesions separated in space and time.
But there is a specific, fascinating physiological quirk tied to MS that the notes spend a lot of time on. The Uthoff phenomenon.
The heat sensitivity.
Yes. The notes state that patients with MS often experience a sudden, severe worsening of their neurologic symptoms when their core body temperature rises. Like during a hot shower or exercising on a hot day, the vision gets blurry, the weakness gets worse, and as soon as they cool down, the symptoms revert. I always wondered how temperature could physically alter a nerve signal. The notes mention a reduced safety margin.
To understand Uthoff, we have to look deeply into the kinetics of the sodium channels at the nodes of Ranvier.
Okay.
In a healthy, heavily myelinated axon, the system is over-engineered. The electrical current reaching a node is usually 5 to 6 times more powerful than the minimum threshold required to open the sodium channels.
It's guaranteed to fire.
That is the high safety fraction. But in an axon stripped of its myelin by MS, the resistance is low, the current is leaking out everywhere. By the time that weakened current barely limps to the next node, it might only be 1.1 times the threshold. It's just barely strong enough to trigger the sodium channels.
A razor-thin safety margin. But where does the heat come in?
Heat affects protein kinetics. Specifically, higher temperatures make the voltage-gated sodium channels open and close much faster. In a healthy axon, this doesn't matter. There is so much current that it easily triggers the action potential anyway.
Right.
But in a demyelinated MS axon, the channels close so quickly in the heat that the weakened, sluggish incoming current simply doesn't have enough time to get through. The channels snap shut before threshold is reached.
The signal fails. A complete conduction block induced purely by a 1-degree rise in body temperature.
And the moment the patient steps out of the shower and cools down, the channel kinetics slow back to normal, the sluggish current has time to open them, and the nerve function returns. It is a stunning, real-time demonstration of biophysics interacting with pathology.
That is incredibly vivid. Now, MS is immune-mediated, but the notes contrast it with another severe central demyelinating disease, PML, progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy.
PML is terrifying, but it operates on a completely different mechanism. It is not an autoimmune attack. It is an opportunistic viral infection.
The JC virus.
Correct. The vast majority of the human population has actually been exposed to the JC virus, and our immune systems keep it completely suppressed, often dormant in the kidneys. But if a patient becomes severely immunocompromised, such as an advanced HIV/AIDS, or a patient taking intense immunosuppressive drugs for leukemia or even for MS itself, the JC virus reactivates, travels to the brain, and specifically infects and destroys oligodendrocytes.
So the end result is the same, widespread destruction of central myelin, multifocal white matter lesions, but the cause is viral lysis of the cells rather than immune attack. It highlights how vulnerable the central architecture is to different vectors. Now, what about the periphery, the hot dog buns?
If the immune system decides to attack the Schwann cells or the peripheral myelin, the classic pathology is Guillain-Barré syndrome or GBS.
The notes describe this as an acute, rapidly progressive, ascending polyneuropathy, usually triggered after a gastrointestinal infection like Campylobacter jejuni.
The mechanism is often molecular mimicry. The immune system generates antibodies to fight the bacteria, but those antibodies mistakenly cross-react with the gangliosides, the specific lipid structures, on the peripheral nerve myelin.
So the immune system basically carpet bombs the peripheral nerves. And because it's hitting the lower motor neurons, we see those LMN signs we talked about earlier. Flaccid weakness, lots of reflexes. And it classically starts in the legs and ascends up the body.
Ascending symmetric weakness. And the ultimate fear is that the demyelination ascends high enough to affect the phrenic nerve, which controls the diaphragm, leading to respiratory failure.
Okay.
Major trap in this section, and this fundamentally shifted how I conceptualize sensory neurobiology, is the assumption that the receptor and the nerve fiber are functionally the same thing.
Blurring the line between transduction and transmission leads to fundamental errors in understanding pathology. Let's use the Pacinian corpuscle again. It is an encapsulated mechanoreceptor deep in the dermis. When mechanical deformation squishes the corpuscle, mechanically gated sodium channels physically stretch open.
And sodium flows in and creates a localized receptor potential or generator potential.
Right. And this local generator potential has absolutely nothing to do with myelin.
Nothing at all.
The myelin is irrelevant at this stage. The receptor potential is an analog signal. It degrades over space. Myelin only enters the equation after that local receptor potential spreads to the initial segment of the attached beta axon.
So if the potential is strong enough to reach the threshold at the very first node of Ranvier, an action potential fires.
Yes.
Okay, so the receptor is basically just the microphone on a stage, picking up acoustic energy and turning it into an electrical signal. The myelinated beta fiber is the high bandwidth broadcast cable transmitting that electrical signal to the studio.
That's a perfect analogy.
The microphone doesn't care what kind of cable is plugged into it, and the cable cannot hear the sound.
Exactly. So if a patient has a demyelinating neuropathy affecting A beta fibers, their Pacinian corpuscles might be transducing mechanical pressure perfectly. The local generator potentials are firing.
But the signal leaks out of the bare axon before it can reach the spinal cord.
Right. The microphone works, but the broadcast cable is severed.
Understanding how these diverse highways function makes it critical to understand how the body actually constructs them and how it maintains, millions of miles of this biological duct tape over an entire lifetime.
It's a huge logistical undertaking.
It is. And the systemic drivers of myelin are split into two major categories in our notes, the builders and the maintainers. The primary builder is thyroid hormone.
Now, when most people think of the thyroid, they think of basal metabolic rate, tachycardia, weight fluctuations, thermoregulation, things like that.
Right.
But during fetal and early postnatal development, thyroid hormone acts as an indispensable morphogen. It is a developmental signal acting directly on the genome.
And the mechanism is remarkably direct. The inactive prohormone, T4, crosses the blood-brain barrier. Local enzymes, called deadenases, convert T4 into the active T3 molecule. And T3 doesn't just bind to the surface of a cell, it translocates directly into the nucleus of developing neural cells.
Yeah, it goes straight to the source. It binds to intracellular thyroid hormone receptors, which then act as transcription factors on the DNA itself.
Wow.
In the developing brain, T3 directly drives the transcription of genes responsible for neuronal maturation, synaptogenesis, and crucially, the proliferation and differentiation of oligodendrocyte precursor cells.
So it is essentially giving the genetic green light for the central nervous system to begin large-scale myelination.
Exactly. And if a fetus or neonate is deficient in thyroid hormone, a condition historically referred to as cretinism, but more accurately termed severe congenital hypothyroidism, the consequences are catastrophic.
But our sources emphasize a very vital distinction here. Congenital hypothyroidism is not a demyelinating disease.
Right, and that terminology matters. A demyelinating disease implies the presence of mature, functional myelin that is subsequently destroyed. Congenital hypothyroidism is a dysmyelinating or hypomyelinating state. The system fails to build in the first place.
Because the T3 signal was absent during the critical developmental window, the oligodendrocyte precursors just never matured.
They never synthesized the immense lipid bilayers, so the intricate networks required for higher cognitive function and motor coordination remain uninsulated and functionally disconnected.
And if the infant isn't screened and treated with exogenous thyroid hormone almost immediately after birth, that lack of structural development becomes permanent, leading to irreversible intellectual disability and profound motor delays.
The window for experience-dependent plasticity and myelination simply closes. You cannot just give a 10-year-old with untreated congenital hypothyroidism a massive dose of T4 and expect the brain to suddenly build a decade's worth of missed myelin. The developmental scaffolding is gone.
That is so profound. Now, contrast that with our primary maintainer, vitamin B12 or cobalamin. B12 operates through an entirely different biochemical avenue to preserve the myelin that has already been built.
Yes, B12 is an essential cofactor for the enzyme methionine synthase. This enzyme is responsible for converting the amino acid homocysteine into methionine.
And then methionine is rapidly converted into S-adenosylmethionine, commonly known as SAM, and SAM is a universal methyl donor in biochemistry.
It donates methyl groups for DNA methylation, neurotransmitter synthesis, and critically for our topic, the maintenance of phospholipids in the myelin sheath. When you are deficient in B12, methionine synthase fails.
So homocysteine accumulates and SAM production plummets.
Exactly. You lose the methyl groups necessary to repair and stabilize the myelin lipids.
But the pathology of B12 deficiency goes beyond just losing SAM, right?
Yeah.
There's a toxic accumulation on another pathway, because B12 is also required for an enzyme called methylmalonyl-CoA mutase.
Right, the second pathway. When that enzyme fails due to a lack of B12, methylmalonic acid accumulates systemically. And the current biochemical consensus suggests this excess methylmalonic acid forces the body to synthesize abnormal odd-chain fatty acids.
Because the oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells are constantly turning over their lipid membranes, they basically begin incorporating these faulty, structurally unstable odd-chain fatty acids into the myelin sheath. It's like replacing high-quality structural bricks with crumbly, defective bricks. Over time, the myelin simply falls apart.
And this presents clinically as subacute combined degeneration. The notes provide a highly functional mnemonic for the resulting neurological deficits. The 3 Bs.
Back, balance, and Babinski. Let's trace the anatomy of those Bs. Back refers to the dorsal columns of the spinal cord. These tracts carry vibration and conscious proprioception using those massive, heavily myelinated A-alpha and A-beta fibers we discussed.
And because they are so heavily myelinated, they are incredibly susceptible to the faulty lipid integration caused by B12 deficiency. As they demyelinate, the patient loses their sense of vibration and where their limbs are in space,
which directly causes the second B balance.
Specifically, sensory ataxia. The cerebellum is no longer receiving the high-speed proprioceptive data it needs to coordinate movement. If the patient closes their eyes, which removes their visual compensation, they will sway and potentially fall. That is a positive Romberg sign.
And the third B is Babinski, referring to the abnormal plantar reflex where the toes fan upward when the sole of the foot is stroked.
A positive Babinski sign is the absolute hallmark of an upper motor neuron lesion. It indicates that the lateral corticospinal tracts, the heavily myelinated descending motor highways from the cortex to the spinal cord, are also demyelinating. The patient experiences spastic weakness and hyperreflexia.
So synthesizing this for the listener, thyroid hormone is the architect and general contractor building the house from the ground up, utilizing nuclear transcription. Vitamin B12 is the specialized maintenance crew, showing up years later with methyl groups to patch the roof and replace the siding.
That perfectly explains why adult-onset hypothyroidism looks nothing like congenital hypothyroidism.
Right, because an adult who develops Hashimoto's thyroiditis and becomes hypothyroid will experience fatigue, weight gain, and cold intolerance. But they don't lose their cognitive scaffolding or forget how to walk.
No, because the myelin was already built decades ago during the critical window. You just give them levothyroxine and the metabolic rate normalizes. But if an adult develops a severe B12 deficiency from, say, pernicious anemia, they will actively degenerate their previously healthy myelin, leading to that subacute combined degeneration.
Okay, so we have the builder and we have the structural maintainer. But running millions of miles of this biological circuitry, keeping those sodium-potassium pumps firing constantly to clear the capacitive charge load, that requires a continuous, immense supply of ATP.
Oh, massive amounts of energy.
And the power grid for this system is vitamin B1.
Thiamine. And our source material drops a massive conceptual anchor here that professionals really must understand. Thiamine is not a primary myelin vitamin. It does not provide structural lipids or methyl donors. Thiamine is an energy metabolism vitamin.
So if B12 gives you the raw materials for the membrane, B1 is the coal burning in the power plant to keep the lights on in the factory.
Exactly. Thiamine, in its biologically active form of thiamine pyrophosphate, or TPP, is an obligate cofactor for 4 enormous energy-producing enzyme complexes in the body. The mnemonic here is, please accept brown bread today.
Which stands for pyruvate dehydrogenase, alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase, branched-chain alpha-keto acid dehydrogenase, and transketolase.
Pyruvate dehydrogenase is the critical bridge linking glycolysis in the cytoplasm to the TCA cycle in the mitochondria. Alpha-ketoglutarate dehydrogenase is a rate-limiting step within the TCA cycle itself. If you lack thiamine, both of those pathways just shut down. Oxidative phosphorylation grinds to a halt.
And when oxidative metabolism drops, ATP production craters. We established earlier that the sodium-potassium ATPase pumps rely entirely on ATP to maintain the electrochemical gradients across the membrane.
So when the pumps fail, sodium continuously leaks into the axon and isn't pumped out. Water follows the sodium via osmosis. The axon swells, intracellular calcium homeostasis is destroyed, oxidative stress skyrockets, and the neuron enters a total energy crisis. The axon itself becomes severely injured or dies.
And when the axon dies, the myelin sheath wrapped around it degenerates.
Right. The myelin loss in a severe thiamine deficiency, which presents clinically as Wernicke encephalopathy or dry beriberi, is a secondary bystander effect. The myelin wasn't the target.
The underlying nerves starved to death from an ATP deficit, and the myelin collapsed because the structure it was wrapping died.
This must be strictly differentiated from a primary demyelinating disease where the immune system targets healthy myelin on a perfectly healthy axon.
Blaming myelin for the damage in a B1 deficiency is like blaming the electrical power lines for a blackout when the actual power plant simply ran out of coal. The lines just happened to melt down because the core system failed.
The phrase from the text is the ultimate summary here. B1 feeds the nerve, myelin insulates the nerve.
That is so clear. Okay, so we've established how the body constructs these networks with thyroid hormone, maintains the lipids with B12, and powers the ATP pumps with B1. Now, let's transition from the microscopic biochemistry to the macro-level expression of this system coming online during childhood.
The timeline of myelination is not uniform. It follows a strict phylogenetic and anatomical progression. In the developing fetus, the phylogenetically older structures, like the brainstem and the spinal cord circuits, mature and myelinate quite early.
Which is a survival imperative. A fetus must be able to display primitive reflexes, swallow, and eventually breathe immediately upon birth.
Right. But the cerebral cortex, the massive wrinkled surface responsible for higher order reasoning, complex sensory integration, and conscious motor planning, and the long association fibers connecting its different lobes, those are profoundly immature and unmyelinated at birth.
Humans are born altricial, meaning we are remarkably helpless compared to many other mammals. Like, a baby horse can walk within hours.
Yeah, but our cortical myelination is largely a postnatal process. It continues aggressively through infancy, childhood, and well into the 3rd decade of life for areas like the prefrontal cortex.
Think back to the biophysics. More myelin equals decreased capacitance and increased resistance, which yields faster conduction velocity. Faster velocity means tighter neural timing.
And that tighter timing allows vastly different sensory and motor networks across the brain to synchronize and integrate their data streams. Behavioral maturation in a child is literally the outward phenotypic expression of this inward myelination and synaptic networking.
Right, so a baby transitions from uncontrolled, reflexive limb flailing to purposeful reaching, grasping, crawling, and walking, because the descending motor tracts are progressively being coated in lipid layers,
allowing high-speed synchronized commands to actually reach the muscles. The visual system is a perfect example of this hardware versus software integration too.
Yeah, an infant is born with anatomically intact eyes, retinas, and optic nerves, but they do not possess adult-level visual acuity or complex depth perception.
Why? Because the cortical processing centers in the occipital lobe and the vast association networks linking visual input to the parietal lobe for spatial mapping are not fully myelinated yet. The raw data is arriving, but the high-speed wiring required to synthesize that data into a coherent, high-resolution perception of the world isn't finished.
Which leads to a massive conceptual trap highlighted in our notes. The tendency to reduce child development to a purely physical equation. Behavior develops because myelin develops.
It is biological determinism, and it is just incomplete. Myelination is an absolute prerequisite for complex behavior, but it is not the sole driver. Complex behavior relies on the orchestrated symphony of neurogenesis, synaptogenesis, synaptic pruning, and environmental interaction.
I want to push back on the biology versus environment dynamic here, just as a thought experiment. If we reduce it to the physical myelin increasing conduction speed, could we theoretically place a child in a sensory deprivation tank, pump them full of perfect nutrition, ideal B12, precise T3 levels, immense caloric energy, and expect them to spontaneously develop complex language and fine motor skills simply because their genetics program the oligodendrocytes to wrap the axons?
Absolutely not. The architecture would fail to organize. The sources provide a vital maxim for this. Myelin makes the network fast, experience makes the network smart.
That is the defining concept of neuroplasticity.
Exactly. The brain operates on a Hebbian principle. Neurons that fire together, wire together. When a child interacts with their environment, stacking blocks, hearing language, failing to balance and falling over, they are firing specific neural circuits.
And the circuits that are used frequently are strengthened. And the oligodendrocytes actually respond to that electrical activity by adding thicker layers of myelin to those specific active pathways.
While the circuits that are neglected undergo synaptic pruning, experience is the architect directing where the high-speed off-ramps are built. A fully myelinated brain devoid of experience is just a massive high-speed highway system with no exits leading to actual destinations.
Experience paves the off-ramps. That is such a beautiful mechanism.
The timeline of speed. Because if myelin is this critical and it can be destroyed in so many ways, we have to ask how we build it in the first place and whether it can ever be fixed.
We touched on regeneration briefly. It is the tragic paradox of the nervous system. The Schwann cells in the periphery, which handle relatively simple point-to-point connections, are phenomenal at regenerating and repairing myelin. The oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system, which govern our highest cognitive and motor functions, are profoundly terrible at it.
But the developmental timeline is what really caught my attention. The notes make a very firm, heavily bolded distinction regarding fetal and neonatal brain development. They state, myelination is absolutely not the same as synaptogenesis.
This is a crucial conceptual leap. Synaptogenesis is the literal wiring of the brain. It is the neurons growing their axons out, navigating through the tissue, and forming chemical synapses with other neurons. It is the creation of the circuitry.
The physical laying down of the cables.
But just because the cables are laid and the circuit is connected does not mean the network is functional. If the circuit isn't insulated, the electrical signals are too slow, too leaky, and too asynchronous to drive complex behavior.
The analogy I came up with while reading this was a massive, newly built office building.
Okay.
The electricians have run all the raw copper wire through the walls. Every computer is technically plugged into the server. The synaptogenesis is complete. But if none of those wires have rubber insulation, the moment you flip the main breaker, the power shorts out, leaks into the walls, and the computers barely flicker.
It's a great visualization. Think about a newborn baby. They possess a vast array of primitive reflexes. If you stroke a newborn's cheek, they automatically turn their head to root for milk.
Yeah.
If you place a finger in their palm, they grasp it tightly.
But they can't voluntarily decide to reach out, pick up a specific toy, and bring it to their mouth.
Because the networks governing those behaviors are fundamentally different. The basic spinal and brainstem circuits that control primitive reflexes develop and myelinate very early, largely in utero. The circuits are fast enough to function at birth. But the descending cortical pathways, like our corticospinal tract, which handles precise voluntary movement, are physically present at birth. The wiring is there, but they are entirely immature and largely unmyelinated.
So when a baby is spending months struggling to learn to sit up or learning to coordinate their legs to walk, they aren't just practicing in a software sense. They are quite literally physically waiting for billions of oligodendrocytes to synthesize fat and wrap it around the descending nerves so the brain's command can reach the legs fast enough to maintain balance.
They're waiting for the hardware upgrade. The physical maturation and myelination of the central nervous system continues aggressively through childhood, refines through adolescence, and doesn't fully complete in certain complex frontal lobe pathways until we are in our mid-20s. The physical thickening of the myelin fundamentally gates our cognitive and motor milestones. But our final section requires us to look at the catastrophic consequences when this beautiful biological insulation is actively stripped away from a mature, fully developed system.
Acquired demyelinating disorders, when the highways crumble. And to organize the pathology, we use the mnemonic OGP.
Okay, so O stands for oligodendrocyte, mapping to central nervous system diseases. G stands for GVS, or Guillain-Barré syndrome, mapping to peripheral nervous system diseases. And P stands for PML, which is a specific infectious etiology. Let's start with the most widely recognized, multiple sclerosis.
Multiple sclerosis falls under the O category because the pathology is localized strictly to the CNS. It is an autoimmune, immune-mediated destruction. For reasons involving complex genetics and environmental triggers, autoreactive T cells cross the blood-brain barrier.
And they mistakenly identify the myelin antigens on oligodendrocytes as foreign threats, right? So they launch an inflammatory attack, recruiting macrophages and cytokines to strip the myelin off the axons.
Yes. And because the oligodendrocytes are distributed throughout the brain and spinal cord, the clinical presentation of MS is wildly heterogeneous. It depends entirely on which specific highway the immune system decides to attack.
Right. So if the inflammation targets the optic nerve, the patient presents with optic neuritis, sudden, painful, unilateral vision loss.
Or if it attacks the medial longitudinal fasciculus in the brainstem, they develop internuclear ophthalmoplegia, which is an inability to coordinate conjugate eye movements. If it hits the dorsal columns, they lose proprioception.
And the hallmark diagnostic criteria for MS, often tied to the McDonald criteria, is that these lesions are separated in time and space. So a patient might suffer optic neuritis, partially recover as the inflammation subsides, and then 2 years later develop profound weakness in their left leg.
Right, time and space. Moving to the peripheral nervous system, we have the Guillain-Barré syndrome. This is also an immune-mediated demyelination, but the targets are the Schwann cells.
The dedicated single axon workers in the peripheral nerves.
Exactly. GBS frequently exhibits a mechanism known as molecular mimicry. A patient suffers a gastrointestinal infection, commonly from the bacteria Campylobacter jejuni. The immune system generates antibodies against the lipoligosaccharides on the bacterial surface.
But unfortunately, those bacterial surface molecules bear a striking structural resemblance to the gangliosides present on the myelin of peripheral human nerves.
Yeah, molecular mimicry. The immune system clears the bacteria, but the antibodies cross-react and begin attacking the patient's own peripheral highways.
And the classic clinical presentation of GBS is symmetric, ascending muscle weakness. It typically begins as tingling and weakness in the feet and legs, and progressively marches upward over days or weeks.
Because it strips the large, heavily myelinated motor and sensory fibers, it is accompanied by aphlexia, a complete loss of deep tendon reflexes. In severe cases, the demyelination ascends all the way to the phrenic nerve, paralyzing the diaphragm and requiring mechanical ventilation.
Then we arrive at the P in our mnemonic, progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy, or PML. This diverges from autoimmunity entirely. It is an infectious destruction.
Yes. PML is caused by the JC virus. Now, the vast majority of the human population is exposed to the JC virus during childhood, and our competent immune systems suppress it into a latent, asymptomatic state indefinitely.
However, in patients who are severely immunocompromised, such as those with advanced HIV/AIDS, or patients receiving potent immunomodulatory monoclonal antibodies, the virus reactivates.
And it crosses into the brain and actively infects the oligodendrocytes. It causes a lytic infection, meaning the virus replicates inside the oligodendrocyte until the cell literally bursts and dies.
Wow.
Yeah. As the oligodendrocytes die en masse, vast swaths of CNS myelin collapse, leading to progressive, multifocal neurological deficits, rapid cognitive decline, and frequently death.
The stack of notes also mentions a genetic etiology, Charcot-Marie tooth disease, or CMT. This isn't an immune attack or a virus.
Right. CMT represents a massive family of inherited peripheral neuropathies, but a classic subtype involves a chromosomal duplication of the PMP22 gene. PMP22 is one of the crucial structural proteins holding the layers of peripheral myelin together. Because the gene is duplicated, the Schwann cells overexpress the protein.
You would intuitively think more structural protein is better, but biochemistry demands precise stoichiometry, right?
Exactly. The excessive PMP22 protein misfolds, aggregates, and triggers the unfolded protein response within the Schwann cell, leading to cellular toxicity and apoptosis. The peripheral myelin destabilizes, causing chronic, slowly progressive distal muscle atrophy, weakness, and sensory loss.
Typically presenting with high-arched feet and stork leg deformities due to the muscle wasting. But whether it is MS, GBS, PML, or CMT, we have to bridge the gap between the cellular destruction and the actual neurological deficit. Why does ripping the myelin off an axon paralyze a muscle? Why does it blind an eye?
We must return to the cable theory and physics from section 1. When you physically strip the myelin away, you are ripping the heavy-duty duct tape off the high-pressure water pipe. The membrane resistance, ROM, plummets.
So the pipe is instantly full of holes again.
Massive current leak. Simultaneously, because the thick layers of lipid are gone, the intracellular and extracellular fluids are separated only by a bare, thin plasma membrane again. The electrostatic attraction skyrockets. Therefore, the membrane capacitance, C-shame, spikes drastically.
So the axon is bleeding current through the newly exposed holes, and at the exact same time, the bare membrane suddenly demands a massively increased charge load just to change its voltage.
It creates an insurmountable biophysical barrier called impedance mismatch. The depolarizing current shooting down the previously healthy inner node hits the demyelinated segment. The current leaks out so rapidly, and the required charge load is so high that the remaining internal current is entirely insufficient to reach the activation threshold at the next node of Ranvier.
The signal doesn't just slow down to C fiber speeds, it completely dissipates.
Conduction block. The action potential literally dies in transit. The motor cortex fires the command to move the leg. The signal races down the corticospinal tract, hits an MS plaque where the myelin has been destroyed, and simply vanishes. The muscle receives zero input.
It is the tragic distinction at the heart of clinical neurology. Dysmyelination, like in congenital hypothyroidism where the network was never built, versus demyelination, where the fully mature, high-speed infrastructure is abruptly severed by an impedance mismatch. The sheer depth of this system is just staggering.
Brings up the final sobering clinical note on development, congenital hypothyroidism. I was initially confused as to why an endocrine disorder was featured so heavily in a neurology outline. Why is thyroid hormone relevant to the speed of nerve conduction?
Because thyroid hormone is the master transcriptional switch for oligodendrocyte maturation.
It tells the cells to build the myelin.
Specifically, during late fetal and early neonatal life, thyroid hormone enters the brain, binds to nuclear receptors in immature glial cells, and violently drives the gene transcription required for the massive lipid synthesis and structural formation of myelin.
So if a baby is born with a defective thyroid gland or severe iodine deficiency and they lack that thyroid hormone,
the oligodendrocytes simply do not mature. The biological trigger is never pulled, the myelin highways are never properly constructed, the synaptogenesis might happen, the wires are there, but they remain naked, slow, and leaky.
And unlike MS, which is a demyelinating disease where existing myelin is destroyed, the notes call this a dysmyelinating state. The highway is just structurally defective from day one.
And the tragic reality is the permanence of it. There is a very narrow developmental window where the brain is primed to myelinate these networks. If the hypothyroidism is not diagnosed and treated with synthetic hormone within the first few weeks of life, the window closes. The lack of myelin permanently severely stunts the velocity of the cortical networks,
resulting in severe, irreversible neurodevelopmental delays. The text mentions that historically, older textbooks used the term cretinism or severe mental retardation for this, which we now categorize as profound intellectual disability. And it all traces back, fundamentally, to the failure to wrap lipid layers around axons.
It is a stark, humbling reminder of how deeply tethered our humanity, our intellect, and our behavior are to the precise biophysics of our cells. Our entire subjective experience is an emergent property of millions of simultaneous signals, all arriving at the exact correct millisecond, governed by the thickness of microscopic fat.
So as we wrap up this massive exploration, let's trace the arc of what we've unpacked today. We started by dismantling the idea of static wire coding, meeting the living master builders, the space-saving fragile octopus, the oligodendrocyte in the central nervous system, and the resilient one-to-one hot dog bun, the Schwann cell in the periphery.
We followed the architecture of the corticospinal tract, from the crowded bottleneck of the internal capsule down through the decussation in the medullary pyramids, and mapped the critical relay handoff at the anterior horn, clarifying why upper motor neuron damage unleashes spasticity, while lower motor neuron damage results in flaccidity.
We dove into the literal biophysics, visualizing how thick lipid bilayers simultaneously plug the leaky hose to increase membrane resistance and push the positive and negative charges apart to destroy the toll booth of membrane capacitance, allowing the action potential to leap brilliantly from node to node.
We established the strict hierarchy of speed, recognizing that the massive 268-mile-per-hour expressways are reserved for vital proprioception and precise motor commands, while deep pain and temperature are relegated to slow, unmyelinated dirt roads to conserve physical space and metabolic energy.
And we face the devastation of when the system fails, contrasting the speed-killing demyelination of MS, JC virus, and Guillain-Barré with the amplitude-killing reality of axonal loss. We saw how a simple core temperature increase can shatter the delicate safety margin of an MS patient's sodium channels, and how a lack of B12 or thiamine can literally starve the highest functioning highways in the spinal cord into degeneration.
The sheer complexity of it all is staggering. I would encourage you, long after you turn this off, to just take a moment and think about your own nervous system. The next time you effortlessly catch a set of keys thrown to you, or simply adjust your posture while sitting, recognize the invisible, lightning-fast symphony of saltatory conduction happening inside your body. You are relying on flawlessly engineered, microscopic lipid wraps to interact with the world in real time.
It's an absolute miracle of biology, and it leaves me with one final, slightly unsettling thought to mull over. If our perception of reality, our reflexes, our ability to learn, and our very consciousness are entirely dependent on the physical integrity and the precise biophysical speed of this myelin insulation, does that mean the subjective speed of human thought isn't some abstract, ethereal concept? Does the human mind literally have a biological speed limit dictated entirely by the physics of simple fats, cholesterol, and the distance between ions? Keep diving deep.
The pathology of primary demyelinating diseases.
Right. This requires us to revisit the physics of capacitance and resistance we talked about earlier.
So let's summarize. Healthy myelin sheath. High membrane resistance keeps current contained. Low membrane capacitance allows the voltage to change rapidly without wasting charge.
Correct. Now, what happens when a disease process physically strips the myelin from the axon?
The biophysics catastrophically reverse.
Exactly. The destruction of the lipid bilayers rips away the insulation. Membrane resistance plummets. The pathways for ion leakage are blown wide open.
So as the electrical signal arrives at the damaged segment,
The depolarizing longitudinal current, the sodium ions, they immediately begin leaking out of the bare axonal membrane into the surrounding fluid.
the leaky hose is back.
The leaky hose is back, and simultaneously, the membrane capacitance skyrockets.
Because the physical distance between the inside and outside fluids is tiny again.
Right. Without the thick fat layers separating them, the fluids are brought close together. The bare segment now stores a massive amount of charge.
So the incoming signal, which is already leaking out, now has to waste its dwindling strength trying to neutralize this newly restored capacitor.
Yes. Between the severe current leak, dropping the resistance, and the massive charge sink, raising the capacitance, the electrical signal weakens exponentially as it tries to cross the demyelinated gap.
The speed of conduction drastically slows down.
And if the demyelinated segment is long enough, the signal attenuates so severely that it fails to reach the threshold voltage required to trigger the next intact node of Ranvier.
It just fizzles out entirely.
Yes. When the local current fails to depolarize the next node, the action potential completely dies. We term this a conduction block.
A conduction block.
The electrical impulse generated in the motor cortex travels down the spinal cord, hits the demyelinated plaque, and simply vanishes,
The command to contract the muscle never arrives.
resulting in clinical paralysis despite the actual muscle and the neuron cell body being perfectly healthy.
That's devastating. And the specific symptoms a patient experiences just depend entirely on which glial cells are targeted, right?
The most critical, life-threatening complication occurs if the demyelination reaches the cranial nerves and the phrenic nerve.
The phrenic nerve controls the diaphragm.
Yes, leading to respiratory failure and the need for mechanical ventilation.
And because those fast, heavily myelinated sensory and motor fibers are stripped, the reflex arcs fail too, right?
Right. The afferent sensory signal from a muscle stretch cannot travel fast enough to trigger the efferent motor response. So patients characteristically exhibit areflexia, a complete loss of deep tendon reflexes, like the knee-jerk reflex.
Okay, so GBS, MS, and PML all involve an external force, either the immune system or a virus, destroying a previously healthy myelin sheath. But there's one final pathology we need to look at, which involves a structural failure originating from the blueprint itself.
Yes, Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, or CMT. It is a hereditary motor and sensory neuropathy. It is not an inflammatory attack. It is a genetic defect in the construction of the peripheral myelin.
Genetic defect.
The most common variant, CMT type 1A, is caused by a genetic duplication on chromosome 17, specifically involving the gene that encodes for peripheral myelin protein 22, or PMP22.
Okay, we talked about PMP22 during the blueprint section. That's a crucial transmembrane protein acting as the staple holding the compacted layers of the Schwann cell together.
Exactly. Now, intuition might suggest that having an extra copy of the gene and producing more of the structural protein would make the myelin stronger, more staples, stronger hold, right?
Well, that's what you'd think.
However, biological assembly relies on exact stoichiometry. The ratio of lipids to specific proteins must be perfectly balanced for the structure to fold and compact correctly.
So the extra protein actually messes it up.
It does. The duplication leads to an overproduction and abnormal accumulation of PMP22 within the Schwann cell. This excess protein destabilizes the entire architecture.
Like trying to build a brick wall, but putting way too much mortar between the bricks.
Exactly. The Schwann cell struggles to form tight, compacted, concentric rings. The resulting myelin sheath is structurally defective, overly thick in some areas, loosely wrapped in others, and functionally incompetent.
The defective duct tape fails to provide adequate membrane resistance.
Right. Because this is a systemic genetic defect, the longest nerves in the body, which rely on the most extensive myelinated stretches to maintain signal integrity, are the first to show the clinical effects.
Because a small leak over a huge distance eventually drains the whole pipe.
Exactly. The clinical phenotype develops gradually over years, usually starting in childhood or adolescence. The slow degeneration of the longest peripheral nerves leads to distal muscle weakness and atrophy, prominently affecting the intrinsic muscles of the feet and the lower legs.
And this causes those classic orthopedic deformities associated with CMT, right? Like very high arched feet, hammer toes, and that stork leg appearance from the calf muscle atrophy.
Yes, it is a slow, structural degradation dictated by a single extra copy of a structural protein.
Man, the complexity of myelin is just staggering. We've traced the anatomy from a single glial cell flattening itself out and spiraling around an axon to squeeze out its cytoplasm, forming a dense hydrophobic lipid barrier.
Right.
We've explored the precise biochemical balance of phospholipids for insulation and cholesterol for structural stability, anchored by proteins like MBP and PMP22.
We examined how this biological insulation manipulates fundamental electrical physics, vastly increasing the membrane resistance to prevent current leak, and dramatically decreasing the capacitance to allow the voltage to change instantaneously.
Which forces the electrical current to race longitudinally down the axon, regenerating only at the densely packed sodium channels at the bare nodes of Ranvier.
And this saltatory conduction enables our thickest A-alpha fibers to transmit crucial data at nearly 270 miles per hour, while reducing the metabolic burden on the cellular pumps by orders of magnitude.
And we've seen how this entire superhighway relies on thiamine to fuel the cellular engines and cobalamin to generate the SAM methyl donors required to actively repair the lipid structures.
The clinical realities really emphasize the fragility of the system.
They really do. When the myelin degrades, whether through metabolic starvation of a B1 deficiency, the structural failure of a B12 deficiency masking behind folate, the genetic misfolding in CMT, or the inflammatory destruction seen in MS, PML, and GBS, the biophysics just reverse.
Resistance drops, capacitance spikes, current bleeds out, and the vital communication between the central nervous system and the physical body is severed through conduction block.
It is a remarkable, flawlessly tuned system when it works. The physical thickness of the fat surrounding our nerves literally dictates the speed at which we operate in the physical world.
You know, if I can leave you with one final thought, something to just ponder regarding the profound implications of all this conduction velocity.
Yeah, please.
Consider the illusion of the present moment.
The illusion of the present moment.
Yes. Your conscious experience feels unified. If a glass slips from your hand, you see it fall, you hear it scrape against the counter, you feel the cold glass slipping from your fingers, and your muscles react to catch it.
Right, it's one event.
You experience all of those events as happening in a single, instantaneous, synchronized now.
Okay.
But the physics we just discussed dictate that cannot possibly be true.
Oh, wow. Because the signals are traveling at different speeds.
Exactly. The physical signals conveying that event travel at completely different speeds based entirely on the varying thicknesses of the myelin wrapping those specific sensory pathways.
Right.
The visual processing of the light hitting your retina operates on one timeline. The auditory processing operates on another. The fast A-beta fibers tell your brain the glass is slipping from your fingers in a few milliseconds.
While the unmyelinated C fibers in your skin wouldn't register the temperature of the cold glass until a full second later.
Your brain is receiving the data fragments of reality at vastly different asynchronous times.
But I don't feel it asynchronously.
No, because the brain takes those fragmented, differently timed signals arriving from the various myelinated and unmyelinated pathways, and it stitches them together.
It edits the footage.
Exactly. It delays some, it anticipates others, and it constructs a perfectly synchronized, cohesive perception of reality for your consciousness to actually experience.
That is deeply unsettling.
That instantaneous now is a post-processed illusion, perfectly orchestrated by the exact calibrated thicknesses of cholesterol and phospholipids wrapping your nerves.
So if your myelin were suddenly stripped away or even just slightly altered,
Your brain's ability to sync the physical world would unravel. Your perception of cause and effect, of time, of reality itself would fundamentally shatter.
wow.
So think about that the next time you effortlessly catch a falling object, or, as we said, feel the delayed ache of a stubbed toe. Your entire reality is perfectly timed by fat.